Good evening. I'm Ann Crable. I'm the director and CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Murdock Mixology. I hope you enjoyed mingling with our local creative community, and I want to thank Harvester Arts for their partnership in helping to extend the invitation. So please join me for just the incredible talent that we have here and celebrating them. I hope you all had a chance to see Nestle 3 by Sharif in the exhibition Heroes, Legends, and Legacy, curated by our brilliant curator, Dr. Tara Hedrick. We are so pleased to welcome Sharif tonight, who will be in conversation with Rachel Delphia, the Alan G. and Jane A. Lehman Curator of Decorative Arts and Design at the, and it's very important you pronounce it this way, the Carnegie. Not the Carnegie, the Carnegie Museum of Art. Rachel is also the organizer of the exhibition Sharif Bey Excavations, which I had the privilege to see during my time in southwestern Pennsylvania, and she is the co-editor of the accompanying publication. Born as one of 12 children, Sharif was raised in a large African-American family in Pittsburgh, and while many of the men in his family left school for jobs in industry, he had a pivotal experience as a high schooler at the Manchester Craftsmen Guild. This is a community arts center. It inspires creativity, learning, and personal growth from the arts. And in particular, they have a really, really strong ceramics program. This played a formative role for him throughout his teens, giving him a foundation of skills and extensive ceramics world connections. Shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, he studied sculpture at the Academy of Fine Arts and Design in Bratislava, Slovakia, and later he earned his BFA from Slippery Rock University, his MFA from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, and then a PhD in art education from Pennsylvania State University. He's inspired by modernism, functional pottery, oceanic and African art, and the art of the African diaspora. His ceramic glass mixed media works investigate the cultural and political significance of adornment and symbolic formal properties of archetypal motifs, while questioning how the meaning of icons and function transform across cultures and times. So please join me in giving a warm Wichita welcome to Rachel and Sharif.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. And Sharif and I both had the opportunity to get to know Anne a little bit during her time in Western Pennsylvania. So thank you for having us. It's really an honor to be here. And I am honored to share the stage. I'm really honored to share the stage with this incredibly talented artist, Sharif Bey, Dr. Sharif Bey. On the screen, you can see Nestle 3, and I hope you've seen this in your galleries. This is a recent acquisition for all of you here at the museum. Yay, applause. I was hoping it definitely deserves that. And what we're going to do tonight at Anne's request is give you a chance to hear a bit more from Sharif about his background, about his practice, and hopefully give you all some greater context for this incredible work that has joined your collection. Sharif and I are not from around here, so I thought we should start with a bit more of an introduction. And I think place is such an important part of, place and community is such an important part of what you're exploring. So I wonder if you could start at the beginning, Sharif, maybe, and tell us a bit about what it was like growing up in Pittsburgh in the 60s and 70s in that big family that Anne mentioned.
Well, as Anne mentioned, I kind of grew up in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is obviously reinvented itself many times over since my childhood, but once upon a time it was an old steel town, and then it became a town with a bunch of unemployed people, and many of the major jobs obviously left, but one of the consistent jobs that most of the men in my family took or have taken are jobs in industry, to include boilermakers and steam fitters. And as I said, I had 12 brothers and sisters. And I guess one of the things that I think a lot about when I think about old Pittsburgh, or just, I guess, maybe even just back in the day, is visiting these small little shops and things. And now obviously we have, Walmarts and supermarkets that kind of, in many regards, replace things like the fruit stands and things like that. But my family has a huge history of makers, but obviously for many of us, making art is a privilege. And many of the talented people in my family stopped making art, including my dad, once they got jobs. And I was one of the few people who kind of stayed with it. And my uncle, who retired way before I can remember, kind of started remodeling his house and spending a lot of his energy creating this kind of oasis directly across the street from me. They had 10 children themselves. But to give you some context, I always describe him as like a Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid. So literally koi ponds, gazebos, murals, sculptures, rose gardens. This was directly across the street, and it provided like an endless sense of inspiration and possibility in what would otherwise be considered a pretty desolate post-industrial landscape. That's I think that's the short of it.
Yeah. Well, I know you, beyond the family and the neighborhood, which I know provided you with a lot of camaraderie and inspiration, and aunts and uncles and all this creativity, and people who had it, who practiced it, but weren't able to practice it for a living. I know you also found some inspiration in cultural institutions, arts and cultural institutions. So maybe you could talk about those early experiences.
Absolutely. And another thing I might add about my family is, although I'm relatively young to have had older parents, my dad, his brothers and sisters are all Depression kids. So kids who were born in the 20s had a very different upbringing with regards to what pastime was and what kind of ways of investing. So everybody played their own instrument, and everybody was able to kind of find beauty and creativity in a different way. So that being kind of setting the stage for me as a seeker and as someone who provided things. And the other thing I think would be important to me is there was always an interest in what many call the other. Because there was always a running narrative, especially once upon a time, of what somebody call cultural domination. So as a kid, my parents were always kind of steering me away from narratives that didn't include me, and we would gravitate and have to really search deeply for narratives that did include people who were of color. So in fourth grade, I was invited to partake in what was then called the Saturday Creative Arts Program at the Carnegie Museum. Now it's called the Art Connection, I believe. But basically, from kids ages, I want to say fourth grade to eighth grade, kids go to the museum every Saturday, and there's curriculum. And ironically, back then, maybe it was to supplement their income, but most of the teachers of the Saturday programs were local public arts teachers. So I don't know if they were, it just was odd to me because I don't see that happening as much today. But you climb the ranks of this program, and you work with a handful of art teachers in the city. And in addition to having the source material at the museum, what was really special to me is the agency that we had as kids in that museum. And when I say that, I mean, we kind of went through the turnstile, if you will, and we would go get our drawing boards, and we would meet at some common place, and then the teacher would instruct us to kind of go about and draw, what have you, depending on our assignments. But that downtime of like wandering through the museum without being guided by a docent or a parent or a teacher became really important time to me. Whether it was before class started or in between sessions, it gave me an opportunity to do what I often call wonder and wander. And there are many things that I met at the museum that I would perpetually visit throughout my life. The other important thing about the Carnegie Museum specifically is also the Carnegie International, which I believe is every 2 years, am I right? Starting back as early as, I want to say like 1896. If I'm not mistaken, it's the oldest international exhibition of contemporary art in the United States.
Yeah, internationally.
And internationally, I think it's the second or third.
Yeah, only the Venice Biennale is older internationally. So it means we're really fortunate to have contemporary art come to Pittsburgh with great frequency.
So what's really interesting to me, it essentially means that every 2 years, from when I was 10 to when I became an adult, I was having to reconsider what visual art was and how it's supposed to function and how it was to be displayed. And it was interesting to be perpetually challenged. And as you all know, what is contemporary is relative to our time, right? So there was a time where Winslow Homer was a real risk taker, right? Now we look at that work now and it's like, oh, Mary Cassatt, what's so different about that? That's pretty conservative. I mean, these were galvanizing works in their time, right? Just like me experiencing neo-expressionism in the 1980s as a fifth grader. These were works that were, hot, sexy, new, provocative as it pertained to how we are defining art at our time. So that was another curriculum. So we didn't have a lot of programming in the official context revolving around the fact that the new and the familiar was suddenly turned upside down every 2 years. But nonetheless, this was still kind of on my way to the drawing boards and the facility in education that I would find before we went out to draw dinosaur bones or what have you.
So beyond the Carnegie, which I know was really formative for you, when you were, I think, 14, you got involved with the Manchester Craftsmen Guild. What was Manchester and what did that mean to you?
So what my experience at the Carnegie did in many regards is it cemented my identity as an art kid. And the other thing that was really special is when you go to a program like that with kids from all over the city, it's not so much about my football team or my baseball team versus your neighborhood versus what school. It really kind of positioned me as a kid as a citizen of the city. And I would see art kids anytime I transitioned to any program, whether it was a museum program or a football camp or middle school, there was always a network of kids who I knew. And so I identified with as an art kid. And when I was 14, there was kind of a recruiter who came into the schools to talk about this new and up and coming facility called the Manchester Craftsmen Guild. And this was shortly after this building was built. So the Manchester Craftsmen Guild unofficially started in 1968. But by 1987, the founder, Bill Strickland, had successfully led this capital campaign to build this amazing building that included, lots of natural light and murals and waterfalls and things that high school kids didn't typically see in institutions. So I went down there and essentially I never left. And one of the things that kind of kept me there was I remember the first day I came, there was a bigger investment of time and resources in me in the first time I was there than my entire K through 12 education up to that point. Like the amount of clay they gave me to work with, the amount of instruction, the facilities, and again, I had a lot of freedom to pursue. And not to mention, as we talked about in my bio, there were perpetually, it was a revolving door of visiting artists. And the program offered, what I often refer to as an intergenerational, interracial, just diversity in every facet. So I'm working with local artists, retired art teachers, hobbyists, as well as college students who are attending the program. And a lot of those art teachers who I met at the Carnegie when I was a kid are pursuing renewal credits through the same program. So it was odd that became my community. So here I'm 15 years old, and my preferred pastime was making pottery with old white ladies. Needless to say, it was a lonely time for me in many regards.
And this is I think the text isn't showing up here, but this is a workshop with June Kaneko, whose work we saw in your collection just this afternoon.
So the format then was, they have a lecture and an exhibition, and then there was a weekend workshop. And during these weekend workshops, all of the local arts community, specifically the ceramics community and all the local colleges attended. So as one of a small minority of high school kids, I kind of wanted to pretend I was a grown-up. And it taught me how to listen and learn to appreciate what I could at that time. But the important thing to me from the context of learning and education and experiences is sometimes these things don't always occur to us right away. The same thing as parenting. I might say something to my 17-year-old son, and it might not resonate at that moment. But one of my favorite quotes is attributed to Mark Twain, where he says, "When I became an adult, suddenly I realized my parents were geniuses." So there's a lot of information that was kind of seemingly falling on deaf ears, technical life history, life journeys, and then suddenly it's like, oh, that thing Paul Soldner told me in 1991, or that one method or that one piece of advice I got from Rudy Audio, like all of a sudden, this information is becoming applicable and real. So I often say I had an amazing and pretty inclusive introduction to ceramic art by way of these stories and these programs.
Yeah, so you really got to meet the who's who of the clay community in the States when you were there. And I know you also have told me, though, that you got this important exposure to the vocational side of art, too.
And to me, that's like still, as an art educator, that's one of my biggest charges, is to instill in people that making art isn't magic. There's this mysticism about the artists and their practices, but the reality is, art is diligence, art is perseverance, art is science, art is reflectivity, and then art is also, the other grind beyond that is building crates and learning how to market your work and learning how to package your work and learning how to talk about your work. There's a lot of mysticism revolving around what it means to have a career as an artist. And there's the other unfortunate thing I think that a lot of people hear that is a deterrent is that you either win or you lose. So you're either a rock star or you're a loser. So there's so many vocational trajectories in the arts that we don't cultivate and talk about. And unfortunately, we happen upon them, but we don't talk about them. And even now, we have a visiting artist program, and we're always trying to bring in the biggest of the biggest names. And I'm like, what about preparators? What about object conservators? What about curators? What about people who just sell at fairs and don't sell at galleries at Chelsea? Are they not important to talk about? And there's a lot of humility in that journey that should be talked more about. It's not like a lottery ticket. So I think it's important to dispel what these journeys are about.
Well, and I think it's interesting as you talk about this journey, and you were very fortunate in the people that you were exposed to and the opportunities you have. Here we're looking at a pre-college program that you got to do in Bennington, Vermont. But at the same time, you're wrestling with what was your role in this community that was opening up its doors to you seemingly, and coming upon things that maybe put it in a little bit of a perspective that was more jarring.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I often say, and this is me again, I have 3 children, so I always talk about like how I want my kids to be able to exist in the world as citizens. And I want them to be open, and I want them to, I always say, the 3 things that are most important is that you learn how to apologize and you learn how to ask for help. Those are probably the 2 most important things that young people need to understand. But there's a lot of jarringness associated with being a part of a community in general. And I was fortunate to learn a lot of resilience by way of kind of initially finding that common denominator, which is just making something, and how making something could muffle that uncomfortable silence of difference. Like, I don't know what to talk about with her. I'll just throw on the wheel and listen to NPR and hope they don't talk to me, right? But then you get to the point where you start to recognize your own agency, and then people are like, well, what happens when you put this glaze in that glaze? And what happens when you fire it this way? So pretty soon I'm like the keeper of institutional memory for that institution, and it's provided me with pretty much everything I need to go from a Saturday class to a continuing ed class where I'm the only person in there under 60 to Central Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. So like what gives one the tools and authority to navigate these spaces where we don't feel like we're heard or seen. This slide here is really relevant because right around the time that I started at the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, this book was in press, American Ceramics, and I don't know how many hundreds of years it covers from 1607 to present.
400-ish, 4 centuries.
And the only mention of any artists of color is, the Edgefield potters, which is like kind of like again, an entity and not an actual person, and then David Drake. And at the time, ironically, the president of the National Education Council for Ceramic Art was James Tanner, who's an African American. So the idea that this, comprehensive history book doesn't include anybody of color is really fascinating to me. And everything, that I was involved in. Fortunately, the Manchester Craftsmen Guild not only was founded by an African American potter, but they provided programming there to include, of course, the who's who, the people like June Kaneko and Audio and Ron Myers, and pretty much, except for Volkus, anybody you could think of. I think Volkus was a liability because of his focusedness. They didn't want him around little kids. But outside of Volkus, pretty much everybody you could think of from that generation was there. Karen Carnes, and also bringing in the fold celebrated African American masters who really weren't recognized by that canon. And these people became, kind of my extended ceramics family.
So this is a workshop with Sana Musasama.
And this is David McDonald, who was a professor at Syracuse University for, 40 years. And I met him in 1989, and we've been friends ever since. And this is David and I at a craft center. This is David on the far left, and that's me with the red hat looking kind of disoriented.
You had the red hat. You had on the same hat in the Kaneko workshop.
Well, I wasn't good at getting up early, and that was, what 15-year-old is. But I did at these centers, they were, something I didn't have at the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, where the security guard would literally, it's time to go. These craft centers, were pretty much around the clock. So a 15-year-old drinking coffee can really get a lot done.
Well, I love that so much of your experience in the arts and in ceramic is about building relationships, and working with an artist like you also helps museums and people like me build relationships. And so these are two of David McDonald's works that are about to enter the Carnegie's collection and join numerous works by you that are already in our collection. And I dare say that wouldn't have come about without getting to know David and his work through you.
And this is Winnie Owens Hart, who I affectionately refer to as my clay mom. And when I talk about these things, like there's obviously so many components to these kinds of relationships, right? And tax questions, and art transport questions, and glaze chemistry questions, But Winnie will say something like, "You've been in Wichita for a long time. You need to get your wife a hot stone massage," So. Like things that I'm not thinking about, and she makes sure that, she'll let me know that, because she also sees both sides of it. She knows what it means to be home as a mom, but she also knows what it means to be a contemporary artist and to be on the road doing your thing. So I'm really grateful to have people in my life who humble me, not only through their life experience and authority, but also through their magnificent artistic achievements.
And I think this is a good juxtaposition between David and Winnie's work and a group of 5 wonderful pots by yours truly. And I think, one of the things that you've shared with me in the past is this moment of kind of wrestling with your role in the arts as a young person and saying, I think I'm paraphrasing you here, I love making pots, I love clay, but what on earth does this have to do with who I am, right? And how can I give back to my community and reflect my identity in my work? And so with that, I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about this pivot, because when you were at Slippery Rock, you were still making a lot of functional work. And then you go to grad school at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and you really went in a different direction. So maybe you could talk about how your practice changed there, and what you added to your repertoire and your exploration.
Well, there's a famous quote from the esteemed potter Roberto Lugo, who says that pottery saved my life. And the founder of the Craftsmen's Guild, I think he likes to say that happened for me because it's a good line. But I had a strong family and a lot of amazing things that were in place well before I came to the Craftsmen's Guild. But it definitely set me on a path that I would have never found otherwise. And I had this retrospective at the Everson Museum, and I was able to talk about decades of work. And I said, look, I was making this when the King riots happened. I was making this during the pandemic. I was making this around the time my daughter was born. And, I have all this history. But I started to think well, ceramics and art in general insulated me in a very critical and vulnerable time, and I'm grateful for that. But then I became strong enough and confident enough that I didn't need that insulation anymore, right? And then I started to think, well, I'm okay. And I was about 25, 26. It's like, I'm not worried about getting caught up in gangs or any number of crossfire or drive-by shooting. I'm in grad school and I'm working in clay and I'm safe. But then, this question, what does what I do have to do with this community, that I love so dear, and all the vulnerable people in it? And I think many artists of color are confronted with this idea of okay, who am I in relationship to who we are? And then this bigger global question is looking at it all, right? So, one of the things that it immediately did is that it made me use my work to address these questions, as opposed to infusing the world with beautiful objects. Maybe I can use this technical vocabulary that I acquired, to ask critical questions about myself and the world, right? And I started early, and I have to admit, I was pretty damn cocky. You get everybody telling you what beautiful things you're making for 10 years straight. It has an impact. But then, it became this bigger quest for humility that I'm still trying to find, right? And when I say that, I mean there are bigger questions about what I really want to do for the world, or how I want to exist in the world, that aren't just about feeding my ego. And I have this appropriated quote that I used for my students that said, "It's ask not what you can do for art, but what art can do for you, but what you can do for art," right? So how can we use these tools to affirm humility as opposed to feeding our egos? Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying don't support my work. But I'm saying that's the bigger question for me that I'm really exploring.
Yeah, and so I see a lot of change. Well, not entirely change, because if we go back to that shot of your first solo show, the one when you were a teenager, you have this beautiful figural pot with two faces kissing. But in grad school, you do a lot more work that's figural. You start working with these objects of adornment, which relate directly to the Nestle piece that's in the collection here.
Yeah, and at this point, I'm doing an identity workshop for people at Mark Arts, and it's a small, tight, intimate group. But one of the things that we're talking a lot about is like how our identities create and impact certain rhythms of our life, right? So, I'm an empty nester now, but if you saw me 22 years ago, I had a stroller and a backpack with a baby in it. Yeah, I think it might have been a double stroller and a baby on my back. But needless to say that the flow of your life works differently at that time. I realized there's a whole decade of television that I missed. And I'm like watching Sopranos now, and it's like, this is an awesome show. Where was I? It's like I was watching Sesame Street. That's where I was. At any rate, but like when the rhythms of your life change, the way in which you move in the world can change. So the work that I'm making now is different than the work that I was making 20 years ago. But at this time, I made this enlightening discovery about components. And a lot of this came about because I had small children and I could not work long, sustainable hours without being interrupted. So what happened is it didn't stop me from being prolific. It completely altered the way in which I worked. So what you're seeing here is me making hundreds of pinch pots and configuring them. And also moving out of conventional spaces for working. I started creating spaces outside of my studio. I can work in my office. I can work in the living room with my daughter. I can work in the classroom, and I can work under the deck. I can work at the fire pit when the kids are roasting marshmallows. So it really created a different balance, a different rhythm. And the beautiful thing about clay, and I can advocate for clay because I know it so well. I'm sure this exists in other materials, but there's so many different rhythms that can jive with our life. And I often say this the same thing about like anything. It's really about an attitude adjustment. So I'm an avid gym goer, and I often laugh at what I call the New Year's resolutioners. And the issue that I have, no offense for those of you who dropped out already, I know it's April, May. But it's really an attitude. We think that it's an all or nothing effort. So it's like, if I can't be there at 5 a.m. with my gym bag and my smoothie, then I may as well say the hell with it. Even if you do 20 jumping jacks before, when you get up in the morning before you shave or brush your teeth, it's more than nothing. Right? So that's never happened. So the point I'm making is to manage your expectations and move from there. It's kind of like a restaurant where you're just expanding the menu before you know what the hell you're doing or what people are being receptive to. And before you know it, you're doing too much of everything, and it just becomes like white noise, right? So the same thing for my studio work. I started to okay, my wife put her foot down. I said, okay, what can I do now? And I had to pick back up and figure out, so how does the aesthetic change with the flow? And that became a big part of the work.
Well, and I love the way that that's continued to evolve, because you made all these pinch pots early on, and as you were saying, it's about the flow, it's about the fact that you could do them in all these different spaces, but then these powerful objects of adornment became an important part of your practice, right? And so then, as you continue to work, you bring in additional materials and have new experiences that takes what started as pinch pots in different directions. And so I thought we could talk about a couple of those experiences that really pushed your practice and materials in a new direction.
Yeah, and I ended up moving with this work and having a lot of success with, again, making components. And then when my wife and kids would go to my wife's parents' house, I'd have this long period of time to configure these things. And then eventually I wrote, I applied for this residency at the Kohler Plumbing Factory. And the work completely changed then, because the premises then is that as opposed to making these pit-fired small pinch pots that I would literally fire at my fireplace with the kids while they're roasting marshmallows at the pit and in the fireplace, I started working with high-fire vitreous china. And at Kohler, which is an amazing facility, the clay slip is like pneumatically pumped in through these giant silos. So I can make molds and basically fill these molds as like watering plants. I just have a hose. And the other proposal was that I would expand the palette. So instead of working with this kind of earthy palette, I started to stain clay and work with clay in a different way, to where the clay itself would actually be colored. And the palettes were really, really subtle. And this is a piece that the Carnegie Museum acquired. It's called Ripened Banana.
And if this shape looks familiar to you from the piece in the gallery, it does, because so much of this is iterative. So I guess the next step in our story is the Pittsburgh Glass Center.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, like, since I was a kid, I was always going on doing things. Once I kind of built my foundation as somebody who liked to make things and hang out with people in different places, the institution kept pushing me out to do this. Go to this pre-college program at Bennington College. Go to this program in Indiana. Go to this program here. And what I learned is that, artists go places and do things, whether it's a residency or a visiting artist thing or a workshop. So one of the things that I want to add is when I go to places, a lot of people try to go and do their work at places. I like to go and see what happens to me when I go somewhere. So it's a different attitude again. So it's like, I knew I was going to work in glass, and I figured I would probably do something associated with the adornment things I was working in. And so I started casting glass and working with the technical support staff there. And this next slide, please. I love this slide because, speaking of rhythms, glass is a whole different ball game in terms of pace. And I can't be that lone wolf artist that I prefer to be. So on the left is a half full kiln load of some of the clay beads that I make. And on the right is a glass kiln to capacity. And not to mention the fact that a clay bead, it costs like literally nothing in material. And one of the glass beads, like in material alone, is like $60, $70. Yeah. So not to mention the time it takes to cast and fire. There's a lot of time invested in these things. So this is, and I didn't add this, but a lot of these pieces are inspired by adornment, obviously, but also natural history. So this is the raptor claw necklace.
This is a whole group of work that came out of this residency that you did at the Pittsburgh Glass Center, and was actually the first moment that we ended up acquiring a whole body of your work. I threw this in here because this is fun too, and the color.
I'm glad you mentioned this. So the yellow piece that you saw earlier is the bird skull piece. Ashley, who's kind of a glass collaborator of mine, she has to distinguish these because we talk about them differently. So this is the one she refers to as the arrow, but it's also inspired by bird skull. These are kind of not cold work, so they're unfinished. But I want to point out that, I'm glad you put this slide in. So I mentioned to some of you that the piece in the museum, in the gallery there, that looks like a lavender, is a glass shift tint. So if we change the quality of light, it'll turn baby blue. So this is it under a different kind of light. And some people, like, I have a couple of these beads in my office, and I just sometimes give them to students. I'm like, you want to see something cool? Take this and go out of my office. And they leave the office, and the daylight hits it, and it changes. Oh, cool! I always hear them run out in the hall and say, "Oh, cool!" But the yellow doesn't change because that's like a opaque frit. But the glass itself will shift colors.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And then this is, I think 2018 was a really big year in that we connected and started planning these various projects. And then the Carnegie acquired work out of that show, and the Renwick curator came. And behind Sharif and Ashley, your glass guru there, that's the wonderful artist who makes the glass pieces with Sharif. But behind them on the wall is, I think, the first Nestle, right? Okay, so moving forward, and we'll speed up a little bit, even though this is all so much fun to talk about. But I've been really honored to have a front row seat to your process and see the way that your curiosity and your constant, asking questions and this proclivity you mentioned to just go somewhere and see what happens to you, right? And I've really gotten to see this work develop. So I thought we would share a little bit about the work that we did together at the Carnegie, culminating in a show in 2021. So this is the outside of our museum in Pittsburgh, the same museum where you came as a kid.
So I mentioned that when I was in 4th grade, I started going to the museum. And of course, I've been to the museum before, but I became like a regular every Saturday museum goer. And this Nkisi Congdon figure, power figure, was one of the pieces that I kind of met when I was a kid. And I didn't read what was on the wall. No docent or museum staff introduced me to it. It was just something that I wondered about and spent time with over a number of years. And it became kind of like the impetus for several bodies of work years later. So I was like, I really like that thing. And so what is the relationship between this object and a potter turned sculptor / art educator who likes looking at things and making things? So that kind of became, one of the focal points of the show. And it was amazing to have this piece that inspired me for so long exhibited alongside of my own works. But I would say probably one of the amazing things, Rachel, next slide, please. Yeah. That for me, I was an art kid, and I wasn't a science kid. My kids are science kids. My son's an IT, cybersecurity dude. But you kind of get a second go around sometime when you do certain things. And I realized through this project that I was more of a nerd than I thought I was, because I'm like hanging out with paleontologists and anthropologists and ornithologists, and what kind of drove my curiosities often is like how it's made, how you do it, and like I want to watch you make a bird study skin. Can you show me how you dissect the starling, and can you show me how you cast the dinosaur bones on site? Like there were so many process-oriented things that drove my curiosity during this project and connected me to these museum folk. In my experience, they're a unique breed, specifically natural history, because it tends to be like a labor of love. Like I met like a neurologist who could have well been had a very lucrative career, but his obsession for primate craniums drove him to a job that like, I love this. I don't want to make money as a neurologist. I want to study ape skulls. And this is more fun, and I'll take the pay cut to do it. And those are the kind of people that I met. So seeing people who had a lot of integrity and were really driven by their interest in their field was what fascinated me. I don't know if this is, I might be off the topic, but this is.
No, it's so true. But I think what I got to witness in going from storage room to storage room with you at the museum was the way that these things, whether it was a functional tool or vessel or the Nkisi Nkondi figure with its use of hardware and nails or birds, how all of these elements kind of went into your brain, and they all resonated, and then they would come back out in your work in all of these different really wonderful ways. And we spent the time, basically the year before the pandemic. Sharif was in Pittsburgh a lot, and so we were running like kids in a candy store through storage. And you were actually in Pittsburgh like 4 days before everything shut down. Mm-hmm. And so then we were Zooming, and you were on a sabbatical working in your basement studio as our project was delayed. But I think a really productive sabbatical.
Oh, for sure. I was a little bit envious because everybody else had off too, but.
Right, made your sabbatical less valuable and less unique. So we're talking about birds, and I think there were a couple unique pieces that you ended up making for the show that really touched on these symbols, these forms that I think are so universal to a lot of human cultures, and also things that you come back to again and again and respond to, both as a science nerd and an art nerd. So the first was were the birds, and what you did with the birds from the Natural History Collection.
So when I got to see the collection of birds, like the first thing that occurred to me are like, these are bird study skins. And some of them go back to like 1907, and they're collected for the purpose of study. And to see a drawer of a specific kind of bird, like I just saw forms and colors, and I wanted to arrange and play with them, much like I would, some of the works that I'm making. And that's what this project came about. Obviously, there were certain preservation rules that I had to follow, but I also had a lot of help in following those guidelines. So basically, I created works with existing, and the thing that I can't get over is like even like one of the museum guards was like, I just see a bunch of dead birds, like I just could not. I mean, to me, like in many regards, especially a museum with a legacy as old as the Carnegie, is, I mean, there's a lot, like it or not, there's a lot of death in museums, right? Works by dead people, things that were killed, things that dead people gave to friends who are now dead, who gave things to the museum in the name of a dead person. And there's also, with that, there's a lot of injustice. There's a lot of lack of regard for the earth, for other cultures, for other people. But nonetheless, this is what it is. So the question that I pose, and I pose to you is, what do we do with all that is behind us? So how do we renew? How do we repurpose? How do we revitalize? How do we recover? And for the sake of humanity. So what do we do with all this death? How do we create new ways of engaging and restoring justice and paying homage to this rock we live on? So in this case, I'm taking a bunch of death and I'm creating something that I regard as beautiful and using kind of a universal radial composition to do that.
Yeah, these were incredible, and these were basically a temporary installation using collection objects from our sister museum, the Museum of Natural History. All right, from birds to bones.
So again, I mean, I'm an avid fan of natural history, and I like to say that I've been looking at natural history, I mean, like many of us have, probably longer than I've been actively looking at art. So when I see a beautiful modernist work by Henry Moore or Barbara Hepworth, I say, it looks more like a elephant skull to me. Or one of my favorite works at the museum is the jaw of a sperm whale. And it's like a ready-made modernist sculpture. So if it wasn't for the pandemic, I was almost given carte blanche for what I wanted to do there. But one of the things I'm probably most proud of is that I was actually given dinosaur vertebra to create works from. As opposed to me making things that look like skulls, then I was actually taking bones and skulls and creating things with them. But finding ways of revitalizing them or infusing them with a new sensibility by way of a new material. So these are various vertebra cast in glass, and it's a clay and glass adornment-inspired sculpture.
And this was great in the middle of the pandemic too, because it was like we were working mostly from home. These casts of bones were made for you. I went in with a mask on and got them from the masked curatorial assistant in the vertebrate paleontology, and then I brought them home and gave them to somebody at the Glass Center who gave them to you.
And one of the things that I remember that's kind of important is one of the paleontologists talked about this piece, and he was saying that like this particular specimen wouldn't be regarded as anything special in the world of paleontologists. It's like an incomplete, marginal, specimen, if you will.
And common too,
yeah, common.
Right? It's like a boring dinosaur.
So the idea of me taking it and doing this to it like gives it a whole new interpretive lens to enjoy its subtleties in a way that if it were just another epoxy cast, bronze patinaed object, it wouldn't be as exciting.
Well, and then the last piece, we have this birds' bones and claws.
Yeah, so I had needless to say, I had a bunch of time because of my sabbatical and pandemic, and I really wanted to make a more commanding, adornment-inspired piece for this center wall. And this one is about, I want to say close to, maybe it's 11 feet long. And the fun fact about these, that unfortunately we don't have any clay work to talk about here physically, but a lot of my pieces I've become very successful in what we call like alternative firings. So I fire them high, but then I'll fire them in my fireplace to get a very unique pattern of carbon on the pieces. And the carbonation is determined by how and what you burn. And some of the pieces I use like embroidered toilet paper against the beads themselves, and it makes a nice floral pattern in smoke. And these, I don't know if we have a close-up.
I don't think we have a detail. We can probably see it. There was a copy of our book on the coffee table. If we get that, if you want to take a look, there's a detail there.
So the giant raptor claw piece, Raptor Return, is it's a very different pattern of carbon that I'm able to produce by way of really cheap toilet paper. So the kind that you really don't want to use unless you're in a bind. The kind that doesn't break. Like I can literally like grab hold of one end and throw the roll and it doesn't rip. But I can wrap these pieces in such a way that gives me almost like a zebra stripe pattern. So if you look at these, they're vibrant colors, but they have nice black stripes.
That was a fun
them.
thing for the docents to tell people which pieces were made with the cheap toilet paper and which ones were made with the expensive toilet paper, because there were two different ones. Oh my goodness, I don't know why this keeps doing this to me. We want to leave some time for questions. I wanted to just end with talking about what you've been up to more recently. This exhibition closed more than a year ago, and you've continued to push your work forward, and some of that's on view here in the state, not in Wichita, but in Kansas City. So maybe you could talk about your most recent work, and then we'll take some questions.
So speaking of like patterns and chapters of one's life, like I talked about me making these beads when I'm in my late 20s and I have young children, and now I'm a young grandfather, and I'm actually, my grandson turned 2 today, and May 4th baby. And my youngest son is starting college in the fall, so I'm kind of an empty nester. So there are things that I can do now with my work that there's no way I could have done at any other chapter of my life. So over the last 2 summers, I went out to the Archie Bray Foundation in Helen, Montana, where they have a clay business that drops tons of clay right off at your door in a forklift and kilns large enough for me to walk in. And what I wanted to do in this time was to create Nkisi-inspired figures that were, at least my height. And these are the figures that, that I've really been using to kind of, it's one of the things that I'm really grateful for. I often say that I'm a sculptor who has a pottery orientation, and obviously sculptors create objects. And one of the things that I appreciate about being a potter sculptor is that there's a different psychology of objects and how objects relate to in proximity to the body, and how we physically think about objects. And that's something I grew up thinking about as a pottery student. How does a cereal bowl compare to a punch bowl? How does a beer stein compare to a dainty teacup, right? So in this case, thinking about these ceremonial objects and moving from the intimate to the monumental is what these works have been about. So now I'm thinking about, as opposed to making works that could be considered as part of a ceremony, I'm now thinking about objects that stand over us and watch over us, and thinking about that power in a way that inspires all by way of scale. And there's a different rhythm to these, because I don't get the kind of gratification that I like to get in my studio. I don't do a lot of drawing. I make 4 or 5 things, and I like to have things in this scale that I'm able to see progressing. It's different and much more difficult to get a conversation going with objects when they're 5 or 6 feet tall. So I moved from the dainty teacup to the punch bowl of sculptures. So these are These are moving from the earlier objects that I would, pretty instantaneously create, because I like to make objects and have objects reflect one another. I don't do a lot of preliminary drawing for my work as much as I'll surround myself in the studio with them. And needless to say, it takes longer to do that with these objects at this scale. But this is the show that's currently at the Belger in Kansas City. And there are 3 of the large scale Inkisi-inspired Guardians that I produced over the last 2 summers.
All right, so we have a couple assignments for you in terms of trips to take to Kohler and see where Sharif learned to slipcast and the incredible artist program they have there, and then also to take a road trip to Kansas City. But I think with that, thank you for sharing all those wonderful backstories. And I don't know, Anne, if we have time.
I hope we left time for questions.
To take a question or two.
I think we have time for like 1 or 2 questions. Okay. So for the sake of me not running around like Vanna White, if you could stand up and project, and if you could repeat the question so everybody could hear, that would be great.
Yes, sir.
You said you had 3 questions. One was to be able to apologize. The other one was to ask for help. What was the third?
Yeah, you know what? Those 2 are so important. Did I forget the third question? Wait a It's probably something like do exactly as I say and you'll be successful.
That is it.
Yeah, no, the last one is please and thank you. Learn how to apologize, learn how to ask for help, and always say please and thank you. Yeah. I think if we can all do those and be genuine in our efforts, we'd make the world a better place.
Thank you for helping us fix the presentation.
Yes.
Have you seen your art represented in your kids?
My kids are at such a cynical age. My daughter said to me a couple of weeks ago, I won some award. She said, you win an award, it's like Beyonce win an award. Who cares? I was like, I guess I'm the ceramics Beyonce in her mind, so I'll take it. It's like, you're always winning an award, Dad. Who cares? So my daughter's a painter, and she says, I go to Mom for compliments and I go to you for truth. Yes.
So just to repeat, as Anne asked us to, we're talking about that balance between the pragmatic and business side of being an artist and the magical kind of mystical exploration, how you found the balance or how you find the balance between those two.
Well, the challenging thing about answering that question is the business side of it is obviously relative to where one is in their career, right? The big rant that I'll try to avoid going on is that, social media makes us think that we can skip certain chapters of our professional development, right? And that's where the humility goes in. When I have art handlers come to my house, they're nervous because they know that in some instances, I know better than they do about what they should be doing, right? And it's because I've done that, right? I don't do it anymore, but I used to be the guy who built the crates and packed the work. So I was just fortunate in my day to have a lot of people around me who I admired, and I just followed them. It was just, the curriculum was that simple. There was no abbreviated road to success. It was like, this is what we do. We build crates, we do artist talks, we do residencies, we work tirelessly, and the part about promotion and all that stuff was, back then it was such a crapshoot. But the way that I understood it, is, hopefully you're there if somebody notices you. Obviously, if you're not working, if somebody happens to pick up on what you're doing, it's not going to take you anywhere. So, if you're doing it for the right reason, then you'll have a sustained career.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you follow your own advice too. In the time that I've known you, you're not afraid to ask for help. And then, in terms of balancing those things, right, is learning. It's like life, the whole process it's lifelong learning and figuring it out.
Well, the other part of that, I personally believe in integrity, and I think that it always wins. I really believe it. Wherefore I think that if we're always bending to earn someone else's approval, we're not really garnering the deserved respect. But there are lots of times where I say no, thank you. I'm not interested in that project. You can't acquire my work. I'm not going there. I don't want to do that. And it's not, I'm not trying to be a Kanye about it. I'm taking a stance for good reason, right?
Rachel and Sharif, I just want to thank you for sharing all of your wisdom tonight. This has been an amazing conversation, and for coming out to Wichita. And yes,
Thank you.
Thank all of you, our members, and please try to get the please and thank you in there. Please enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Anne.